The prairie winds carried the smell of dry earth and crushed wheat that summer, the kind that clung to a woman's hair and made her skin sting after sunset. For 5 long years, she had walked the same worn path between the porch and the corral, her shadow stretching thinner with every passing season. The house was large, silent, and cold, not because of its size, but because love had long abandoned it. Her husband had gone from gentle to distant, from distant to cruel, until the space between their hearts had grown wider than the desert itself. Each morning, she woke beside a man who no longer looked at her, and each night she fell asleep to the sound of his boots leaving the porch and his horse fading into the dark. The only warmth left in her life came from the glow of the lantern she kept by the window, though she could not remember why she still lit it. She was not born for this life of silence. Once, her laughter had startled doves from the trees, her hands soft and full of dreams. But the West had its way of carving people down to their bare bones. The sun took her color, the wind took her softness, and her loveless marriage took what was left of her heart. The neighbors whispered that she was cursed, that any woman who lived 5 years without love would be turned into stone. Sometimes, she wondered if that was already happening, if she was slowly turning into part of the land. Another forgotten monument between the wheat and the hills. The nights on the frontier were long, especially when the moon hung low and the coyotes sang of something broken. She would sit on the porch in her thin shawl, staring at the horizon where the fields met the wild, and think of the stories her grandmother once told of men who came from the mountains, their skin kissed by the sun, their hearts loyal to the earth. She had never believed those stories until the night she saw him. The wind shifted, and with it came a strange stillness, as if the whole world held its breath. Out of the tall wheat a shadow rose, not a stranger's, but something ancient and untamed. His presence was not of this quiet world she knew. He moved like the land itself, steady, proud, and dangerous. The fading light caught his face first, the strong jaw, the wild strands of hair tied with feathers, the eyes that glowed like amber under the dusk. He was wounded, his shoulder wrapped in a strip of torn hide, blood soaking into the earth beneath him. Instinct made her step back, but pity, or perhaps fate, made her step forward. She didn't know why she didn't scream. Maybe because something inside her, the part that still dared to feel, recognized the same loneliness in him that had lived inside her for years. The Apache didn't speak, not at first. He only looked at her as if trying to remember something he'd lost. When she reached for him, her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the shock of touching something alive again. His skin was warm despite the cold air, and for a moment she forgot the house behind her. The husband who wouldn't care if she vanished, the years she'd spent waiting for nothing. She led him inside quietly, past the old piano that hadn't sung in years, past the table still set for 2, but used by 1. She laid him on the couch by the fire, her fingers brushing the dust and blood from his face. Outside, thunder rolled over the plains. The rain came without warning, hard, relentless, washing the dust from the windows, the fields, and perhaps from her own soul. She watched the storm for a long time, her heart beating faster than it had in years. Every drop felt like a whisper against the house, telling her something was about to change. Behind her, the wounded man stirred. He spoke a few words in a language she didn't understand, his voice deep and soft, carrying a weight that stirred something ancient inside her. She didn't answer. She only watched as his eyes met hers again, steady, searching, unafraid. The lantern flickered, throwing shadows that danced like spirits around the room. She saw the scar that crossed his chest, the necklace made of bone and silver that rested against his skin, the symbol of his people's strength. And she realized that, for the first time in years, her heart was not heavy. It was wild, confused, alive. He had not come for her, yet she felt as if he was the one she had been waiting for all along. The house that once felt like a prison now held a pulse. Quiet, dangerous, and full of meaning. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the fire, listening to his breathing, wondering who he was, what land he came from, and why fate had brought him bleeding to her door. The dawn came slow and golden, spreading across the wheat like a second fire. When he finally opened his eyes again, the world outside had changed. The rain had washed the dust away. The air smelled of life. And she, the woman who had been empty for half a decade, suddenly feared what her heart was trying to tell her. He stood by the doorway, the rising sun framing his figure in gold. She wanted to ask if he would leave, but the words died in her throat. Instead, he turned and looked at her, truly looked with a gaze that stripped away every layer of loneliness she had built. She felt her breath catch, her pulse race, and a tremor run through her chest. In that gaze, she saw something she had forgotten existed: kindness wrapped in strength, pain softened by understanding. The day stretched ahead like a secret. The man who had walked out into her life from the wild seemed to carry with him a promise she couldn't name. He spoke little, yet every silence between them was louder than words. She didn't know that before the next sunset. Her heart would know what it meant to be truly seen, and before the next dawn, she would no longer be the woman she was. But for now, the prairie wind whispered through the wheat again, bending it like an ocean of gold. Somewhere in that whisper lay the sound of destiny approaching, soft as breath, fierce as thunder. And as the Apache's shadow fell across her porch once more, she realized the storm that had come to her house had only just begun. The morning after the storm, the land smelled clean again, like the earth had taken a deep breath after years of holding it in. The sun rose slow over the hills, pouring gold into the wheat fields that swayed like a restless sea. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to glowing coals, and she stood quietly by the window, hands clasped tight against her apron. The man was still asleep, his breathing deep and even, his face turned toward the light. Something about him unsettled her, not fear, but the strange pull of knowing that her life had just crossed into something she didn't understand. For years, Urdeus had been predictable. Wake before dawn, feed the hens, sweep the dust that never seemed to leave, wait for a husband who had long since stopped speaking to her, except for what was necessary. But now, the rhythm of her home had changed. There was another heartbeat inside those walls, another presence that didn't belong to her past or her marriage. The stranger's horse had vanished into the storm last night, and his wound had bled through the cloth she'd tied. She didn't know who he was or why he'd come through her land, but she knew he wouldn't survive another night without help. She walked to the table and poured water into a basin. Her hands trembled as she wrung out the cloth, remembering the warmth of his skin beneath her touch. She'd tended to wounded animals before, broken wings, scraped knees, but never a man like him. He looked carved from the earth itself, every line of him carrying stories she could only guess at. The scar across his chest caught the light now, a pale mark against bronze skin. It was not the kind of wound a man got from farming or trading, it was a warrior's mark. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and a crow landed on the fence post, cawing into the silence. She turned toward the sound, feeling a shiver crawl down her back. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of hooves carried through the fields. It reminded her that her husband's ranch hands and riders loyal to his name often patrolled the land this time of day. If they saw an Apache anywhere near the property, they would shoot first and bury questions later. She looked at the man again. His chest rose and fell steadily now. There was something peaceful about him, something that didn't match the stories she'd been told as a child, the stories of raiders and killers, of fire and vengeance. Those tales had been whispered by men who had never met one of them face to face. Now, standing in the golden morning light, she wondered how much of what she had believed was true. The memory of her husband's last words before he'd left 3 nights ago came back sharp. He'd said he'd be gone till harvest, trading cattle in the next county. And she'd felt nothing at his leaving, no worry, no sadness, just relief. But now that relief twisted into fear. If he returned early and found this man here bleeding under her roof, she didn't know what he'd do. The Apache stirred. His eyes opened slowly, dark as storm clouds. And for a moment he didn't move, just watched her. There was a calm in his gaze, a kind of patience she wasn't used to. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, roughened by thirst. He said a few words in his tongue, then tried again, broken English forming slowly between his lips. "You. Save me," he he said, his accent soft but heavy with meaning. She nodded, unsure what to say. You were hurt, she replied, her voice low. You needed help. He tried to sit up, and she stepped forward quickly, placing her hand on his shoulder. Don't, she said. You'll tear the wound open again. His eyes met hers again, steady, unflinching. No soldiers? He asked. Not yet, she said. But they ride near. You can't be seen here. He nodded once, his jaw tightening. There was something in that look, something that told her he understood more than he let on. The air between them grew still, heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. She turned away, busying herself with the kettle, though her hands shook. You can stay until the rain dries, she said quietly. Then you'll have to go. Before she didn't finish, the sound of a distant gunshot rolled across the hills like thunder. The man's eyes flickered toward the window. Your husband? He asked. She didn't answer. She only poured water into a cup and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed, and for a heartbeat, the world outside vanished, the dry land. The years of emptiness, the loneliness she had worn like a second skin. In that single touch, she felt alive again, as if the blood in her veins remembered what it was meant to do. He took the cup and drank slowly. I go when sun falls, he said, his voice firm. No trouble for you. But she couldn't let him leave, not yet. There was a reason fate had brought him here, and though she couldn't name it, she felt it deep in her bones. Rest first, she said, almost pleading. The land will wait. He gave her a small nod of thanks, then leaned back, his eyes closing once more. She stood there a long while, watching the play of firelight across his face, feeling a strange ache in her chest. As the day wore on, she moved through her chores like a ghost. Every sound from outside made her heart jump. She caught herself glancing toward the couch, making sure he was still breathing. By noon, she found herself standing by the doorway, looking out over the golden fields. The land stretched wide and endless, yet she had never felt so confined within it. The horizon had always been her cage, but now, for the first time, she wondered what lay beyond it. When evening came, the wind turned cooler. The Apache had woken again and stood by the window, staring out at the dying light. Your land, he said quietly. Beautiful but lonely. She looked at him, startled. You can tell that from one glance. He smiled faintly, just enough for her to notice. You look same way, he said. She didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not even when she'd been a bride. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but her heart betrayed her. She did feel lonely, and he saw it without needing her words. The air thickened between them again, like the weight of a storm that hadn't yet broken. Somewhere outside, a wolf howled, and the sound carried over the open plains like a warning. She turned toward the window, suddenly uneasy. They'll come searching, she said softly. If they find you, he turned to her, his expression unreadable. Then they will try to kill me, he said. Like they did before? She froze. You've been hunted. He nodded once. They took my people's land. My brother died protecting it. His hand touched the scar on his chest. They think I die too. But I live. For him, his words hung in the air, heavy and raw. She saw the truth in his eyes, the grief, the fire, the strength. And in that moment, she realized that everything she had been told about men like him was a lie. He was not a savage. He was a survivor. The last light of the sun slipped below the horizon, turning the fields a deep red. She felt her breath catch again. Something was changing inside her, something she couldn't stop. He moved toward the door, his shadow stretching long across the floor. I go, he said quietly. Night hides better than day. She wanted to stop him, to tell him not to walk back into a world that would never forgive him. But the words tangled in her throat. He looked back once, his eyes meeting hers with the weight of something unspoken. If you ride again, she said suddenly, her voice trembling, ride east. The river runs thick there. No patrols. He gave a single nod. You care? He said softly. She looked down. Maybe I do. He lingered for a moment longer, then stepped out into the fading twilight. The wind caught his hair, and the world seemed to pause as he disappeared into the sea of gold. She stood there long after he was gone, the house quiet again, the lantern flickering by the window. But deep inside something had shifted. For the first time in 5 years, she no longer feared the silence. Because now, she knew it carried his memory, the stranger who had come from the wild, and reminded her what it felt like to be seen outside. The horizon glowed faintly under the rising moon and far off in the dark. She thought she heard the sound of hooves, slow, steady, and heading east. The land was still, but the storm between her heart and the wild had only just begun. The night he left, she thought it would be the end of it. She told herself that come morning, everything would fall back into place. The quiet porch, the sound of the windmill turning, the empty chair at the table. But when dawn came, the world didn't look the same. The golden fields outside glowed softer, gentler, as if the land itself remembered his footsteps. She tried to lose herself in work, churning butter, feeding the hens, sweeping the floors until her hands burned. Yet every corner of the house carried a trace of him, the faint smell of smoke. The blanket she had used to cover him, the dent on the pillow where his head had rested. For the first time in years, her home felt haunted, but not by ghosts, by memory. That afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon. The moment she saw the dust trail rising behind him, her stomach twisted. It was her husband, returning days earlier than expected. His horse galloped hard, its coat shining with sweat, and when he reached the yard, he didn't dismount right away. He just sat there, surveying the house, as if something felt off. She wiped her hands on her apron, forcing her face calm before stepping out to meet him. "You're home early," she said softly. He climbed down, his boots striking the earth heavy and sharp. "Trade didn't go well," he said. "The river flooded. Drove cattle off course. Lost half of what I went for." His voice carried the edge of a man used to disappointment, but too proud to admit defeat. He looked at her, eyes narrow, searching. "Something wrong here?" "You look different. Just tired," she said. "The storm hit hard last night." He stared at her for a long moment, then walked past toward the porch. "Storm or not," he muttered, "you could have cleaned the tools." "Everything's rusting." She followed quietly, her mind racing. She prayed he wouldn't notice the faint bloodstain near the hearth, or the torn cloth she'd burned in the fire. But men like him had sharp eyes for small things, especially when they didn't trust much anymore. He set down his gloves on the table and turned, sniffing the air. "Someone been here?" he asked. Her pulse jumped. "No," she said too quickly. "No one rides out this far." He studied her again, his jaw tightening. "You sure?" "I'm sure." He said nothing for a long while, then walked toward the barn. She stood frozen, listening to his boots crunch on the dirt path, waiting for the sound of the latch opening. If he found the tracks near the back gate where the Apache's footprints led toward the creek, it would all be over. When he returned, his hands were clenched. "You had company," he said, voice low. "Who?" She swallowed hard. "I told you, no one." He grabbed her wrist, not hard enough to bruise, but enough to silence her. "Don't lie to me," he said. "You think I don't see the signs?" There was a horse. Tracks near the east field. Who was it? One of the ranch hands? She met his eyes then, her fear curling into something sharper. "Does it matter?" she asked quietly. For a moment, he looked at her as if he didn't know who she was. Then his grip loosened. "You've forgotten what matters," he said, stepping back. "I'll find out who's been sniffing around here." That night she couldn't sleep. The air in the room felt too heavy, too full of unspoken things. Every creak of the floorboards made her flinch. Every gust of wind sounded like hooves in the distance. When her husband finally fell asleep, she slipped from the bed and walked out to the porch, wrapping herself in a shawl. The moon hung low, casting silver light across the wheat. Somewhere out there, she thought, he might still be riding. Wounded or hunted, she whispered a silent prayer into the dark, half for him, half for herself. Days passed. The tension in the house thickened like the summer heat. Her husband became more watchful, more distant. He questioned her about the food stores, about the lantern oil, about every small thing, as though testing for lies. One afternoon, a pair of men rode up neighbors from the next property, both Rough Riders with rifles slung across their backs. They spoke in low tones with her husband while she worked in the kitchen, pretending not to listen. "Found smoke north of the river," one said. "Could be strays, could be worse." Her husband's reply came cold. "If it's Apache, we'll ride at dawn." Her breath caught. The spoon in her hand slipped, clattering against the table. The men glanced toward her, but said nothing. When they left, her husband looked at her again with that same sharp suspicion. "If you see anything strange," he said, "you tell me first." That night, she made her choice. When he fell asleep, she crept outside, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The sky was clear, the stars wide and endless. She followed the creek, barefoot through the grass, until she reached the line where the wheat met the woods. The trail was faint, almost gone, but she saw where the stalks had been bent signs of someone passing through days ago. She followed it, whispering his name into the dark, though she didn't even know if he would hear it. The forest swallowed her voice. But then, a soft movement among the trees. She froze. Out from the shadows stepped the Apache. His wound had healed some, though he still moved carefully. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the night holding its breath around them. "You came," he said finally. She nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "They're looking for you." "My husband, the neighbors. They'll ride north at dawn." He looked past her toward the horizon. "Then I must go farther." "You can't," she whispered. "They'll track you." He studied her face, his expression unreadable. "Why tell me?" "Because I couldn't let them find you," she said. "Because you don't deserve to die for something you didn't do." He stepped closer, close enough for her to see the faint scar on his temple, the line of dust along his jaw. "You risk much," he said quietly. "For me, I know." He reached out, his hand brushing hers lightly, a touch so careful it almost broke her. "If they find you here, they won't," she said. "I'll go back before dawn." The night was alive with crickets and the hum of wind through the grass. For a while, they didn't speak. They just stood there. Two souls caught between worlds that didn't forgive love or kindness from the wrong kind of people. He turned away first. "There is a place," he said, pointing toward the east. "Beyond the canyon, my people wait there. We move when moon changes. You should not come again." "I have to," she said before she could stop herself. "You don't understand. If they catch you, they'll hang you without question. You saved no one but me that nighttime that makes you their enemy now." He looked at her then, something deep and unspoken in his eyes. "Then I will remember you," he said softly. "When I ride into the wind, I will remember the woman who saw me not as enemy, but as man." Her throat tightened. "And I'll remember the man who taught me what it meant to be alive again." They stood in silence until the first light began to paint the sky pale gold. She turned back toward home, her heart heavy with the weight of every word unsaid. When she reached the house, her husband was already awake, standing by the window. "Where were you?" he asked. She froze. "Getting water? At this hour?" His tone was quiet, dangerous. "You think I'm blind?" She met his stare, the lie trembling on her tongue. But before she could answer, a horn sounded from the fields. The men had gathered early. She could see their shapes in the distance, rifles glinting under the rising sun. Her husband grabbed his hat. "We ride now," he said. "If he's out there, we'll find him." She stood in the doorway, watching as they mounted their horses and thundered off into the wheat, their silhouettes swallowed by the light. The dust they left behind hung in the air like smoke. She pressed a hand to her chest, whispering a plea the wind carried away. That day felt longer than any before, every hour stretched thin with dread. She tried to work, to move, but her thoughts ran wild images of him running through the grass, of gunfire breaking the morning calm. The sun dipped low, and still the riders didn't return. When the first one came back, his face was pale. "They found tracks near the ridge," he said. "Blood, too. Don't know whose." Her husband said nothing. He walked past her, into the barn, his steps slow and heavy. She stood there, gripping the edge of the doorframe, her heart pounding. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the man who had changed her life was either fighting for his or already lost to the land that gave him birth. The world outside glowed red with twilight again. And she knew one thing for certain: whatever happened out there, her heart would never belong to the cold silence of her old life again. The night returned with a heaviness she had never felt before. The air smelled of gunpowder and dust, carried on a restless wind that moved through the fields like something searching. The lantern burned low in the window, its light trembling against the glass. She had left it there for him, just as she always did, though she didn't know if he would ever see it again. The riders had not come back since sundown, and every sound outside, the creak of the barn door, the cry of a night bird, made her heart leap. She couldn't bear the waiting, the not knowing. Somewhere out there, between the dark trees and the ridge, a man might be bleeding while her husband hunted him like a wolf. She paced the small room, hands clasped tight, her bare feet brushing the worn floorboards. The memories of the last night they spoke came back to her again, and again the way he looked when he said he would remember her. The way his hand had lingered in hers for a heartbeat too long. She tried to drive it from her mind, but love, once awakened, refused to die quietly. It grew louder inside her with every breath, drowning out fear and reason alike. By midnight, she could take no more. She pulled on her shawl, stepped outside, followed the faint glow of the lanterns the riders had left behind near the eastern field. The moon was half full, the land awash in silver and shadow. Her heart pounded as she crossed the fence and moved toward the ridge where the horizon rose like a dark wall. Every whisper of grass beneath her feet sounded like footsteps chasing her. The fear of being seen, of being caught, only made her move faster. She reached the edge of the ridge and paused. Down below, she could see flickers of firelight campfires, 2 of them burning low. Men's voices carried through the still night air. She crouched behind a boulder, holding her breath, straining to listen. "Tracks go east," one voice said. "He's hurt. Won't make it far." Another voice, her husband's, answered, "We'll finish it before morning. He's not getting past the river." Her throat tightened. They were close, too close. If they crossed the river, they'd find the path that led straight to where he said his people waited. She couldn't let that happen. She turned to move back, but a small rock shifted under her heel and rolled down the slope. The sound was faint, but it was enough. What was that? Someone called. She froze, pressing herself against the cold stone, her breath shallow. The seconds stretched long and cruel. Then came the sharp click of a rifle being cocked. "Over there," she ran. The dry grass tore at her legs as she fled through the shadows, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. A gunshot cracked through the night, the sound echoing across the hills. She stumbled, falling hard, the dirt scraping her palms. But she didn't stop. She scrambled to her feet and ran again, heart hammering, lungs burning. Behind her, the voices shouted, growing louder. She veered toward the old irrigation ditch, half hidden by tall weeds, and dropped into it, the cool earth swallowing her whole. She pressed herself flat, praying they wouldn't follow. The world narrowed to the sound of her own breathing and the rustle of the wind in the grass. Footsteps approached, heavy boots, no more than 10 yards away. A match flared, lighting the edge of a man's face. Her husband. His eyes swept over the field, sharp as knives, before he tossed the match aside. "If she's here," he muttered to the others, "we'll deal with her too." Her blood ran cold. The footsteps moved away slowly, fading into the distance. When the last sound disappeared, she finally dared to breathe again. Tears slid down her face, streaking the dirt on her skin. She waited until the world was silent before crawling out of the ditch. The firelight on the ridge was dim-nowed, just small red eyes burning in the dark. She turned toward the east, toward the place he'd said his people would be, and began walking. The journey felt endless. The night stretched on, stars watching from above. The wind carrying the faint smell of smoke and iron. Every step she took made her think of him, how his voice sounded, how he had looked at her as if she were the only living thing worth seeing. She didn't know if she would find him alive, but the thought of doing nothing felt worse than death. By the time she reached the river, the first light of dawn was crawling up the sky. Mist rose off the water, curling like breath from the earth. She stopped at the edge, listening. There was no movement, No sign of him. For a moment she thought it was over, that the world had already decided his fate. But then, faint and distant, came a sound she would never forget. The low, steady beat of a drum. Her heart leaped. She followed the sound upstream, pushing through reeds and mud until she saw him. He stood on the opposite bank, leaning against a rock, his arm wrapped in blood-soaked cloth. His horse lay nearby, its side rising and falling weakly. He looked up as she approached, his eyes dark with exhaustion and surprise. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough. "They're coming," she said, breathless. "Your wound, you can't fight them like this." He looked toward the horizon. "They won't stop," he said. "Your husband leads them. He wants me dead." She shook her head. "Then we can't stay here. There's a ravine east of the bend. If we make it before they cross, they won't find us." He tried to rise, but his leg buckled beneath him. She rushed to his side, sliding an arm under his. "Lean on me," she said. Just for a while. Together they stumbled along the riverbank, their steps uneven but determined. Behind them, the distant thunder of horses began to rise. The sun broke fully over the plains, turning the water into a mirror of fire. He stopped once, looking back, his expression unreadable. "If I die," he said quietly, "they will say I was a killer. Promise me you will not let them bury my truth." "You won't die," she said, her voice shaking. "Not here." But even as she said it, she could see how pale he'd become. His breath came shorter now, and blood seeped through the bandage again. The sound of the riders grew louder. She could hear her husband shouting orders, his voice cutting through the morning air. They reached the ravine, narrow and deep, hidden by wild brush. She helped him down the slope, her hands trembling with fear and urgency. Once inside, the noise of pursuit dulled. They crouched among the rocks, both gasping for air. For a brief moment, it was silent, except for the river's distant rush. He turned to her, his gaze soft but fierce. "Why do this?" he asked. "They will call you traitor." "Maybe I am," she said, "but I'd rather die knowing I did what was right." Above them, the sound of hooves slowed. Shadows passed across the ridge. Her husband's voice came again, closer now. "He's near. Spread out." She looked at the Apache, her heart hammering. "Stay here," she whispered. "Don't move until I tell you." Before he could protest, she climbed out of the ravine and stood on the open ground. The riders were closing in fast. Her husband was in front, rifle in hand, eyes hard as stone. When he saw her, he pulled the reins, his horse rearing slightly. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" he demanded. She forced her voice steady. "He's gone." "You're chasing a ghost." He narrowed his eyes. "You know where he is?" "I don't." He dismounted, stepping closer, his shadow falling over her. "You think you can protect him? That savage killed men last winter. You want to die with him too?" Her voice broke. "He's not what you think," Nuffy snapped. He turned to the others. "Search the ravine." "No," she shouted, moving in front of him. "He's hurt. He's not a threat. Let him go." Her husband stared at her, disbelief twisting into fury. "So it's true," he said quietly. "You're with him." She didn't answer. The silence between them was louder than any word she could have spoken. The men behind him shifted uneasily, their rifles catching the sun. He raised his gun. "Step aside," her heart raced. The world seemed to narrow until all she could see was the weapon in his hands. The fury in his eyes and the trembling line between love and death drawn across the morning air. Behind her, she could hear the faint rustle of movement, the Apache, struggling to rise, ready to face what was coming. The first bird of dawn cried from a distant tree, and the sound pierced the silence like a warning. The trigger clicked. The wind died. And in that breathless instant, everything hung suspended between two choices, one born of hate, the other of Lavande, whichever way it would fall. No one in that golden field would ever be the same again. The gunshot tore through the morning air, sharp and final. For a long moment, the world held its breath. The birds went silent, the wind stopped moving, even the horses froze as if the earth itself was trying to decide what came next. She felt the shock before the pain, the sound, the recoil, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the clean air of dawn. Then everything blurred into motion again. Her husband's hand still clutched the rifle, the smoke curling from its barrel. His eyes were wide, not with anger now, but with disbelief. He hadn't meant for the shot to find her. He'd meant it for the man in the ravine. But it didn't matter anymore. The moment his finger pulled the trigger, fate made its choice. She staggered back, her breath catching in her throat. Her hand pressed against her side, where the blood spread warm beneath her fingers. The sound of his voice reached her faintly, her name, shouted in panic, but it seemed to come from another world. She fell to her knees, the wheat brushing her face like gentle hands. The sky above her spun, golden light flickering through her vision. Then there were arms around her, strong, familiar. The Apache had climbed out of the ravine despite his wound, his breath ragged, his face set in fierce determination. He caught her before she hit the ground fully, pulling her close, his voice low and trembling. "Stay," he whispered. "You stay with me." She tried to smile, her lips pale. "You shouldn't have come," she said. He shook his head, pressing his forehead against hers. "I told you I would remember you," he said softly. "Now, I will remember your courage too." Her husband stood frozen a few yards away, the rifle slipping from his hands. The other men didn't move. No one spoke. The sight before them, the wounded Apache holding a dying woman, her face serene despite the pain, was something that stripped away all sense of pride or vengeance. It was human, raw, and undeniable. The Apache lifted his gaze toward them, eyes burning with sorrow instead of hatred. "No more," he said, his voice breaking. "No more blood." Her husband stepped forward, guilt twisting across his face. "I didn't mean go," the Apache said quietly. "Go before I forget mercy." For a moment the man hesitated. Then he turned away, his boots sinking into the dirt as he walked toward his horse. The others followed, silent and heavy, their shadows stretching along behind them. None of them looked back. When the sound of hooves faded into the distance, the land grew quiet again. She rested her head against the Apache's shoulder, her eyes fluttering open to the soft light spilling over the plains. "The sky," she whispered. "It's beautiful today." He looked up at it too, the endless stretch of gold and blue, the promise of a day that would go on even after they were gone. He held her tighter, feeling her heartbeat falter against his chest. "You saved me," he said. Her breath came faint, almost a sigh. "You taught me how to live again." The wind moved gently through the wheat, carrying the scent of earth and morning. For a long time, he sat there with her in his arms, the sun climbing higher behind them, till the light grew too bright to see through his tears. When it was done, he carried her down to the riverbank. The water was calm now, the current slow and clear. He laid her there among the reeds, placing her shawl over her shoulders. From his neck, took the small silver and bone necklace he always wore, the one that had belonged to his brother, and placed it in her hand. Then he whispered a prayer in his language, one the wind could carry to the spirits of her ancestors as well as his own. He stayed until the shadows stretched long again, then rose. His wound ached, but he did not look back. Some goodbyes are too sacred for words. He crossed the river slowly, the water rising to his knees, the reflection of the setting sun painting him in fire. When he reached the far side, he turned once more toward the land she had called home, the fields, the house, the hills beyond. The lantern still burned faintly in her window, a final promise to light his way. Years passed. The war between settlers and tribes faded, replaced by uneasy peace. The land changed, fences rising where the wild once breathed free. But in the small valley by the river, wildflowers grew thick and untamed. Locals called it Widow's Rest, though few knew why. Travelers who passed through swore that on still evenings, when the wind came from the west, you could hear a woman's voice singing low and soft among the reeds. The man who had once hunted her husband's cattle never returned to those lands again. He found his people east of the canyon, as he had promised. But the story of the woman who had saved an enemy's life was carried in whispers through the years, told around fires and over dinner tables. Some said she was a saint, others said a fool. But those who truly listened heard something deeper, a story about love born where it was least expected. And the cost of finding freedom in a world ruled by fear. Her husband never spoke of her again. The ranch passed two strangers, and his own life shrank into silence. But in his final years, when the wheat would sway in the wind and the sky turned to gold, he would pause, hat in hand, and look toward the ridge. Perhaps he heard the echo of her voice there, or perhaps it was only the wind reminding him of what he had destroyed. The Apache grew old under a different sky. His hair turned gray, his body marked with scars, but his eyes stayed sharp, watching every sunrise, as if searching for something he once lost. Sometimes at dusk, he would take a small wooden box from his box that held a strip of faded cloth and a single wildflower pressed between its folds. He would open it and sit in silence, the firelight flickering over his weathered face. When he finally left the world, his people buried him on high ground overlooking the plains. Beside him, they placed a carving of two hands joined together, carved from bone and wood. The wind that moved through the valley that day carried no sorrow, only peace. And so the land kept their story. The river kept their voices. The golden fields kept the memory of their footprints side by side. The house where she had once lived fell to ruin, but the porch still stood, and the lamp hooks still swung in the wind. On certain nights, when the moon rose bright and the stars crowded close, travelers swore they could see the faint glow of a lantern in that window again, and the outline of a woman standing there, waiting for someone she knew would always return, not in flesh, but in spirit. It was said that love, once found, never really leaves the land that gave it life. It lingers in the air, in the soil, in the hearts of those who hear the story and understand its truth. A loveless wife, forgotten by the world, had found her meaning in the most unlikely place, in the arms of a man the world called her enemy. And though their time was brief, it burned brighter than all the lonely years before. In the end, the story was not about death or sorrow or even forbidden love. It was about rediscovery, the quiet strength of the human heart, the courage to see past hate, and the way one single night can change the course of a lifetime. The fields would always grow back. The rivers would always flow, and somewhere between them, the memory of that love would forever remain unwritten on paper, but etched deep into the soul of the old American frontier,